Picture this: the powerful beats of Afrobeat stars can overshadow the voices of millions of Nigerians seeking change. In today's engaging discussion, we'll examine the role Nigeria plays in Africa's economic and political landscape, the impact of elections on the continent, and the coverage or lack thereof by African journalists. So let's dive in and find out why Burna Boy rocks more than Nigeria's elections. You're welcome to our short video series drawn from the regular Friday column titled Conversations with Azu, a weekly diary on life and politics. Do stay and enjoy the session as we talk about how and why, in some countries, gist in the media about Burna Boy, Kiss Daniel, or Davido might command more attention than elections in Nigeria. Azu, the award-winning columnist, is here with me to expand the scope of our recent conversation. You're welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me once again, Julius. It's a pleasure to be here.
As a teaser, your headline presumes, and the story proves that Burna Boy could be more popular or better known than, for instance, Channels TV in Nigeria or SABC in South Africa. Taken in context, does this suggest a loss of faith in governance? Or put in another way, does it suggest that people are bored with hard news, elections, wars, crises, and conflict all over the continent?
Thank you very much for that question. It's quite loaded, isn't it? But I think it suggests a couple of things, a number of which you mentioned, a number of which you referenced in your question. But let me just provide some sort of background to to some of this. I picked up somewhere earlier this afternoon that revenue from music accounted for 30%, grew by 30% in Africa, especially the West African sub-region. In fact, in the West African sub-region, is around 34.7%. That's revenue from music alone, music that we make, which is part of the genre, the popular genre that you mentioned. So clearly, there's a growth pattern in that. But if you put that side by side with what is happening in politics, especially young people involvement in politics, I think in 2010, the number of active young people who were involved in politics in 2010, active involvement being in terms of voting, and was it just about 14%? And progressively, that you can see that was 13 years ago, but progressively we've seen the numbers go down. In Nigeria's recent election, I'm sure that you saw that this in the last 24 years, the numbers in terms of the number on roll versus voter turnout was the lowest in the last 24 years. So numbers have been declining. But again, you have to interrogate and engage the INEC data itself, to find out what exactly, how dependable the data that. But that's I guess that would be the conversation for another day. But what we found in the current election quite clearly was that was significant youth interest in turnout in many parts of the world. And in many parts of the country. That was widely reported to vote during the elections. But of course, the outcome of the ballot of February 25th was not exactly, things didn't go exactly the way they expected. But if Burna Boy was to have a concert in Abuja or in Port Harcourt or Lagos or anywhere, I am sure that this sort of turnout, and I'm just using Burna Boy as one of the icons, it's not the only icon, there are many icons, of course, there's many of them. This sort of turnout that you would have would be nothing compared, and maybe the user satisfaction, if you like, would be nothing compared to the sort of experience that most young people who form the bulk of our population will nothing near the sort of experience they had with the last elections. So clearly there is a concern about voter interest, voter apathy, and voter information, because these are three different categories of voter disengagement, if you like, especially among young people. There's what they call voter interest, there's voter apathy, then there's also voter information. But all of this put together, the long and short of it, so to speak, is that clearly there is something that is broken about governance and about politics that society needs to work very hard to fix.
I would have loved to ask whether it is because the processes instituted by INEC is changing the dynamics where we used to have overvoting because of tendencies towards rigging and all of that. But
Yes.
we'll leave that for another day.
Well, I can just touch on that briefly, if it's matter. I'll just touch on it very briefly. Clearly, the introduction of beavers generated significant interest, especially among young people. And there was quite a significant young population that had not voted that would be voting for the first time as well. But of course, there was huge disappointment because of the delay in the upload to INEX IREV. And that created significant disappointment, especially among the young people who had clearly expected a much higher level of performance.
Okay, thank you very much. You really believe that the world press focuses on American elections should be the same way the African press focuses on Nigerian elections? Or does it diminish the stature of Nigeria that they do not, or is it a reflection that the country is not as important as we presume it is in the eyes of our neighbors and other countries in Africa?
Well, in political science, you learn that countries, foreign policy, the sum total of foreign policy is a projection of the power of a country, of the internal dynamics of the strength. That is what we project. Whether we have been left behind or whether we have been left behind, or that would be a conversation. That's a good conversation for some other time, I hope. But what that speaks, what it says about where we are in our state of politics is what I find particularly interesting. So, yes, I mean, I expect a certain level of engagement because often we people complain that when the foreign press, the major foreign press, when they report activities or things going on in Nigeria, they're only concerned about death, diseases, and destruction. These are the famous 3Ds that that they comment on. So you would ordinarily expect, and I've had the privilege of serving on a number of continental judging platforms for journalists. I I would have expected a much deeper level of engagement with what's happening in Nigeria, keeping in mind that Nigeria is not only the continent's largest democracy, it is also the continent's biggest cashier in terms of crisis. So I expected a much level of engagement and interest, and also a number of African countries are lining up to have their own elections. And you remember what happened in Kenya and the fallout of that, and Raila Odinga's party is still protesting on the streets of Kenya, so again, elections have become major trigger points for unconstitutional changes in government in the sub-region. So for that and for a number of other reasons, I expected a slightly deeper level of engagement, and I was, to be honest, disappointed that it didn't turn out to be that way.
Again, your research true up quickly follow that many media institutions in Africa are not financially capable of following up
That's
issues
correct.
like this. Now, I want to give you an analogy using the BBC, and that would be on the follow-up of the question that are African media institutions capable of competing with foreign media institutions? If you look at the BBC, it's a foreign media institution, one of the biggest broadcasters in the world.
True.
The BBC is broadcasting in Nigeria in our local languages, Igbo, Hausa, Yoruba, and is again reaching out to us in our lingua franca, the language of the street, which is Pidgin.
Yes.
So our local media institutions are not even capable of maybe even running a vernacular tabloid side by side with the English copies. So again, I repeat the question: are our media institutions capable of competing with foreign media institutions when it comes to financial strength and capacity?
Well, it depends on what you mean by competition and how people compete. Of course, quite obviously, the BBC is a public broadcaster and has quite an enormous resources at its disposal. And I do not know any African country that has a broadcaster. SABC does fairly well, but I do not know of any African country that has a broadcaster that is as resourced as the BBC. But you see, the thing about competition is that you play to your strength. All right. So you don't so yeah, someone may be more resourced than you are, but when you know what your strengths are, you play to your strength. So what do I mean? There is an African story to be told, okay? And the advance in technology, especially the widespread use of phones and other forms of digital technology. I know that this is still an evolving scenario, but that has also made it a lot easier to tell the African story today than used to be the case. So when you are competing with BBC, you see, remember that quite a significant amount of the feed that many of these foreign broadcasters get, which they use and retail, are content that they also get from here, from us. Nobody can tell your story better than you can. Nobody can tell the African story better than African journalists can. All right. So I think that it's something that journalism itself needs to engage and interrogate. Why it is that, and a number of the people that work for these major broadcasters are Nigerians or Africans who work for them. Exactly. So it's something we need to look at. We don't have necessarily need to compete with them in terms of spread, in terms of the type of resources that they deploy in the coverage of story. But we know the African story better than any other person does. So I would expect that we play to our areas of strength. You talked about pidgin, for example, and vernacular, which are popular means of of communication, languages of communication on the continent. There is no reason why we should not play more to our strengths in area where we have them, and find small ways of telling these stories. And I believe that if we do that consciously, I believe we can do it much better than any foreign broadcasting can.
Thank you very much. And you observed correctly that the local press does not provide rigorous coverage or has a short attention span when it comes to issues like this. And fundamentally, how do you situate the little disguised partisanship in our local media? Everything, it doesn't all boil down to ownership control.
Well, partisanship in and of itself is not a bad thing. I mean, of course, you know what happens between Fox News and I'm just citing that as an example, and CNN and other major networks in the US and in different parts of the world. Even Rupert Murdoch's, platforms across the world have their biases. All right, so partisanship in and of itself is not. Yeah, I think what I believe that we as African journalists need to do, because the market is more pluralistic now also than it used to be. So the market is also far more diverse today than it used to be. So and consumers are far more discerning. Consumers of media and media products are far more discerning. So if they find that a particular platform is become too obviously partisan, they have options and they have choices. And as I always tell people, ultimately the market will punish you. I mean, because and by the market, of course, I mean consumers. If you do not get the numbers, you don't get the advertising, you don't get all of that, and you don't get the eyeballs or whatever it is, and people find that you are consistently, blatantly, and brazenly partial in the coverage of your stories, it will just be a matter of time before you pay for it.
And I would like us to close this session with the challenge you threw at the media about the upcoming elections in Sierra Leone.
Yes.
Do you foresee that perhaps we might just be sponging off the foreign media in reporting events?
Unfortunately, that may be the case. There are reports already that the ruling government of SLPP has taken steps, and these steps did not start this year, to make the political space, far more toxic than it ought to be. So, and it is not what you say on the eve of an election or on the day of an election or the day after, when we all converge, with foreign observers and all of those things, or local observers, or whoever they are, and then we're all caught up in the election fever, and all we are reporting are numbers, turnout, violence, and what happened. Like, as I said, in the case of Nigeria, the election story started, and we had months, if not years, but specifically from flag off to the first round of elections on the 25th of February, we had about 5 months. That was a 5-month runway for the press, for both the local and Continental Press to engage the story. Is only 3 months away. June is just about 3 months away in Sierra Leone. So, in telling the story of the Sierra Leonean, and you remember Sierra Leone has been a very volatile sport on the West African coast. I think it's a story of interest that we should start telling now. So by the time we get to the eve of election, we have provided both context and understanding for people who are going to go out there to exercise their democratic rights. It's not just descending on the country on the day of election that makes your coverage valuable, as I would like to say. It is what you do long before, during, and of course after the elections. And I hope that what I have shared with on the platform will just be more or less, if you like, a wake-up call, both for us and for colleagues across the continent, to engage the continent's issues a lot more than we are doing at the moment, because nobody is going to do it for us.
Thank you very much. I think that is the right note on which to wind down this discussion. Conversation with Azu is published on the back page of Leadership Newspaper and syndicated in Vanguard newspaper of the same day. It is further syndicated in Nigeria, Argentina, South Africa, Ghana, Europe, and the United States. If you really want to get the gist between the lines, take a few minutes and read the full content on azuishepene.com. Be sure to drop your comments, follow, like, and share our page. You won't be disappointed. Thanks for deepening the conversation, Mr. Azu.
Thanks once again for having me, Julius. Thank you.
And you can follow Azu at Twitter /Azu Ishepene. Thanks for watching.